Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Stories for Dark and Stormy Nights, Volume 4, Story 1. I was working in the receiving area of a Walmart one day, around 2 or 3 in the afternoon. I was walking down the main back aisle, and something moving caught my eye. It was the size of a tennis ball and colored orange. It was about 9 feet from the ground and coming from a T section in the aisles. So in other words, it was coming from the next aisle to my right. It was traveling to the wall on my left like someone was throwing it. I stopped in my tracks when the ball went through the wall. After about 5 seconds of waiting and wondering what I just saw, I ran to the next aisle to my right, where the ball came from, and no one was there. I searched around very quickly but found no one. I went back to the shopping area of the store and told a very good friend of mine, who pretty much dismissed it. I know I saw it. I have no doubt. I am 40 years old and have a pretty good head on my shoulders. I can sense a lot of things, kind of like playing chess and knowing what will happen in 5 moves. I'm also a problem solver in my mind. But the story goes deeper than that. As of this writing, this Walmart was built 4 years ago, and I was hired before it opened, and I worked there for 3 years before moving on. From very early on, while working there, I would see someone walk up to me from behind out of the corner of my eye. I would turn to see what they wanted, but no one would be there. It would happen around 3 or 4 times a day, to sometimes as much as 4 or 5. Seriously, I spoke to others about this, but not one would say they believed me or had seen it themselves. I've been gone from there a little over a year, but I still see people out of the corner of my eye. Just 2 weeks ago, I was working and saw the same thing multiple times in just a few minutes, but every time I looked, it was gone, or it was just something else. Now, I also love to hammock camp with my 2 sons. But now, I don't know if it's just because I'm extra alert, I hear every little twig and acorn fall to the extreme. I hear packs of dogs fighting and running through the woods. I even heard a horse in the middle of the night where they could not be. I'm not scared, but I do get a little nervous when I hear footsteps in the woods going around my camp, and I ask myself, who or what is that? Story number 2. I was in high school working and flipping burgers. Well, after some time, they made me a manager. I was in charge of closing up and depositing the money at the bank, but I didn't have a car, so I relied on a nightly ride from my family. One day, they were late, or I was early to close up. All the employees had left, and I'm sitting there in the back, looking out to see headlights coming in. It's not my ride. And I got this terrible, uneasy feeling that I couldn't shake. I noted the car make, the model, and there are at least 2 people in the car. I squatted down so that they didn't see me. I think if they attempted to come in the back, I would run out the front and vice versa. They were ugly-looking people, no doubt, and they circled around the back really slow. I saw the headlights keep going, and then they left. With normal customers, I don't get worried, but this was different. Slow speed, the whole 9 yards. Finally, my ride got there, and off we go. It wasn't until months or maybe a couple of years later that 2 murderers were arrested in a prominent case. They described the car, and I saw the mugshot. I can't help but think that this is the guy I saw that night pass through my parking lot. Next story. I'm not sure that most of you know about the Australian bush, but it is very vast, creepy, and a strange place. For those that live here, or even traveling from overseas and walk through the bush by yourself, you will understand this disturbing feeling of awe and isolation. Anyways, I wasn't even camping out in the bush. I was just walking my dog on a dirt road track with my very good friend. We were far in, just casually walking through the outdoors, when all of a sudden my poor pup stops dead in his tracks with his tails between his legs. Now, my dog was raised as a mummy's boy, but will protect us from any unwanted intruder. He's a Staffy Cross King Charles Cavalier, a very funny and unique looking dog. Back to him stopping in his tracks. I thought a snake had struck him, or maybe a spider, but he did not yelp. Me and my friend were very confused of our situation. Something very close by had made my dog cower, and we were both looking around trying to find out what had caused it. Then we realized that nothing was making a sound in the bush at all. No wind, no birds, no insects. That's when a surge came over me and my mate of being watched, and all three of us could feel it. We gave up and turned back the way we came, and even my dog ran with us with his tail between his legs until we got back to civilization. This has not happened to me since. I regularly train in there with another mate for the Army, doing our 2.4-kilometer jog through the tracks and back, and I've done it alone plenty of times. Another good mate of mine told me that a bad motorbike accident happened in there a while back, and a few Aboriginals and other men live out in tents in the area. I've scouted their campsite a few times, and it was far away from where the incident with my dog was. Not only that, but I tried to take my poor pup back out there for a jog. We got 10 meters in the track, and he refused to go any further. I didn't feel anything this time, but he sure as hell remembered what was lurking in there that day. I rarely go back into that part of the bush, but me and a mate are planning on a camping trip out there when the rain and the flood stop. I just hope curiosity doesn't kill the two cats. One thing is for sure, I don't go jogging in the bush ever anymore. Far too many bush panthers around. And I know about my predatory animals well, especially the ones down under. I've had friends tell me on the Sunshine Coast hinterland near the Glass House Mountains that they found on their property a devoured cow completely killed in the fashion of a large predatory cat. Lots of tourists and locals alike have ill-hearted fates and strange disappearances while exploring this country, so just be aware and be on the safe side. Next story. Philadelphia has one of, if not the biggest, in-city park systems in the country. 9,000 some acres in a major city with a long-term crime issue. So I guess I'm not sure if what I remember was creepy people or something else. Now, it has playgrounds that are just playgrounds, but it also has parks, woods, and creeks, bike trails, etc. I much preferred the park as a kid. I rarely went alone because it was in the 90s and my mama was afraid I would get jacked by a crackhead or kidnapped or whatever. Or in her words, but she let us go in groups of kids, or if I took the dog. Generally, I loved it in the creek and playing on the train tracks and all that stuff. But there were creepy things too. We would find things in the woods, candles and pit traps dug out in the hiking trails, then covered over, stuff like that. Wrecked cars that hadn't been there the last time but were sort of covered over. But I remember once going to the park with my younger sister and our best friend when we were teens. So we would have been 15, 14, and 12. And I just remember feeling watched. We came out of the woods into a parking lot behind an empty building, and there was this black car with a thin gold pinstripe. An old Trans Am, I think, or maybe a Camaro. And it was empty with the windows rolled down. I did look in it. I didn't see anyone. My sister, who was the youngest of us, said, "That's a mean-looking car." I remember her saying that. We must have walked 20 yards towards it and didn't see anyone in it, but once we three girls were past it, it turned on. My friend said, "Keep walking, just keep walking." And we did, but it followed us at like 3 miles an hour and didn't pass even though we left plenty of room. My friend said, "Jesus Christ," but it didn't sound quite like just a teenage girl cursing, if that makes sense. Finally, it went past us, and its windows were rolling up as it did. It had its really dark tinted windows, but I saw the guy, and he was really, really white, and his eyes were so bloodshot. I could see it from that far away. We were out on the street by this point. He went around the block once and came up behind us, and we went into a store and bought ice cream. When we came out, he was gone. My sister said, "Did you see his eyes?" My friend said, "He looked like he was wearing a mask." I found out later that there had been bodies found in the park, and also Santeria sacrifices. And I, remembering back, I think that was one of the last times that we went back to that area of the park, even if there was a group of us. It just felt too risky. Next story. My brother went out on a camping trip about 25 years ago. This took place around the far west Texas region, in and just outside of El Paso. He'd woken up early to go pick up some friends. They were headed to one of the nearby forests in New Mexico for a 2 or 3 day trip. I think all of them were 15 or 16 years old. None that I can remember were highly superstitious, and they all seemed to have pretty level heads on their shoulders. It was before dawn. I believe they had picked up 3 of the 4 people. They pulled up in the last person's driveway, while one of them went to the back door to get the last person and head off. As the 2 were carrying their gear from the back of the house, they both saw what appeared to be a grayish figure off in the distance moving toward them. They said it moved as if it were not walking but floating just slightly off the ground. The house sat on a big lot that there was initially some room between the 2 people and the gray figure, but it seemed as they ran and looked back again that the figure was closing in much faster than they were moving. The closer it got, the more it looked like a woman in a white dress. The car had backed into the driveway and was facing the road, so the first thing the driver and the other passenger heard were 2 people fleeing the back door open and screaming for them to hit the gas and get the heck out of there now. The driver did just that. He and my brother claimed they did hear something that sounded like clicking and scratching on the car as they fishtailed out of the driveway, but I don't know if that was a bit of writer's embellishment after the fact. They sped down the street, and it wasn't until about 20 minutes later, as they were heading down the highway, that the 2 people told the others what they saw. Everybody was freaked out, and I'm sure it made for an interesting remainder of the camping trip. Apparently, this is not an unusual encounter with a figure called La Llorona, from a very deeply rooted folklore in that region of the Rio Grande. My brother and his friends all claimed they knew nothing of the folklore, and I know my family never discussed or knew anything of it. A few days later, one of the girls that had seen the figure said she looked out the window into the backyard of her house, and she saw several dark crows circling and landing in her trees, more than she had ever seen, and for some reason, she felt that this was all connected, and it was an omen of bad things to come. I never did find out, though, if that was true or not. Next story. Up in northeast Pennsylvania in the Scranton area, we used to ride 4-wheelers on the coal piles and strip mines. It was thousands of acres of abandoned property covered in old quarries. Well, after riding all day in the summer, you'd be black from head to toe, and we'd camp out at a quarry for the night. We'd swim in the quarries to get the black dust off. We did this for years, until one night we woke up to thunderous splashes from across the quarry, about 300 yards across the water. That side of the quarry was 300 feet of vertical cliff to the water surface, whereas we were camped right at the water level. When we woke, we saw flashlights bouncing around, then heard a vehicle leave. Never thought much of it until the next year. What used to be a little dirt bike trail heading down to our campsite was now a friggin' logging road stoned over. We rode into town to talk to the locals. FBI had come in with cranes and scuba divers after learning that New York mobsters had been driving down to the quarry and dumping bodies. They pulled 50 55-gallon drums up full of concrete and body parts. That was our last overnight trip. In hindsight, I'm glad they came in the wee hours of the morning. Had they come earlier, we would have been up drunk and yelling, or at the very least our campfires would still have been blazing. Next story. This happened back around 2010. I went up with my friends to one of their family's hunting lands on the Alabama-Georgia border to do some four-wheeling and just kind of mess around on the land. I wasn't aware at the time, because my friends somehow didn't mention it, that this area is a huge meth hotspot. They have a few hundred acres, and it's adjacent to a bunch of their friends' land, so it ends up being well over 1,000 acres of trails and places to ride around. We always stop at this one pond and chill out and have a couple of beers and some jerky before we hit the trails again. This time we went, there was one of those cheap plastic patio chairs all busted up with duct tape on the sides and broken 2x4s and cricket paddles left around it, all of them covered in blood. Obviously someone didn't do their job either dealing or paying for their meth and had the living hell beat out of them while they were taped to the chair. Once we were able to get to a place with cell reception, we called the police and they headed out to check it, what we had talked about. Surprisingly, when we called, they knew exactly the spot where the pond was located at the first moment that we mentioned it to them. Clearly, they've had problems there before. When they showed up, they told that this is nothing out of the ordinary and that the pond is usually dredged out once or twice a year because this is where all the meth heads dump the bodies of people they've killed or of their buddies who OD on drugs. Needless to say, anytime we go back there, we are all packing a pistol on our bodies and usually a shotgun attached to the four-wheeler. Unfortunately, the land is just too good to pass up. My friends have a ton of really top-notch four-wheelers, so I can't pass up the opportunity to go. But we're definitely 1,000 times more wary when we're out there now. I'll never forget seeing that blood-covered chair and paddles. Meth heads be crazy. Next story. It was the winter of 1997, I believe. I was living in Ketchikan, Alaska, and serving in the National Guard. I loved it. As some may know, a joint task force between all the branches of military began working on building a road on a nearby island, a net island. This was the fulfillment of a 50 or so year treaty the U.S. made with the sovereign Indians and Metlakatla. This was a big project, and I believe it finished in '07. Anyways, the Marines spent the first summer building the headquarters. It was a series of plywood huts in the framework of a mess hall. When summer ended, the huts were basically just sheds. There was no electricity or running water. While me and 5 other members of my unit were called to active duty, we were tasked with living on the island for the winter and protecting the camp. Apparently, the local native youth would hop from island to island, vandalizing vacant logging camps and such. This was classified as a training mission for budget purposes. It seemed like it would be a good time, 6 months in the winter on a remote island living in a plywood hut. At first, things were somewhat rocky. There was only going to be 4 or 5 of us on the island at a time, with a weekend rotation every 2 or 3 weeks for 1 or 2 of us. It took a couple of months before we had a real generator or propane to cook with, so we subsisted on MREs 3 meals a day for quite some time. The worst was that there was only 1 outhouse in the entire camp, which was placed a few hundred yards from the camp. To make it even worse, the Native Americans, for whatever reason, declared the ground sacred and we were not allowed to relieve ourselves on it. That meant that if we needed to take a leak or drop the kids off at the pool, we had to march on down to the outhouse in the Alaskan winter. For the most part, I was loving it. We bonded together, told jokes, played push-up poker, and overall just had a grand time roughing it. Well, to make a long story longer, the hard winter came and so did the snow. Lots of snow. By that time, we had these weird heaters that ran on diesel fuel, so we were quite cozy in the huts. However, the one facility left unheated was the outhouse. And not only was it freezing, it was filling up. You see, the bay the boat used to bring the poop truck had frozen over. By the 3rd month of our stay, the entire outhouse's contents were dangerously close to rising above the toilet seat. It was disgusting. It was freezing. It became my nightmare to use. Give me a slit trench or an outhouse any day of the week. Even now thinking of this massive frozen mound makes me cringe. I can still see the steam that would rise from the hole and out the vents of the porta potty after each use. Anyway, despite the bizarreness of the outhouse, that is not the scary part of the story. One night, as the 4 of us were laying around on our cots ready for a bed, a few of us were listening to a book on tape that the doc had brought with him. I think it was Carl Sagan's Contact. It was either that for entertainment or Art Bell's Coast to Coast radio show, the only English station we could get on the radio. If you don't know who he is, check it out. It's all about aliens, Bigfoot, and other paranormal stuff. Well, we heard noises outside. Now that may not seem scary, but let me tell you, we hadn't heard many noises night or day. There isn't a whole lot of action going on during the winter in the middle of nowhere. At first we thought it might be some native kids come to goof off and tag the place or set it on fire. It seemed logical. Before we came to this island, we had been given tours of nearby logging camps, which were decimated. We were warned that this was what they would do to our camp if we didn't protect it. Well, if it was them, we were ready for them. Wait, no, we weren't. Who am I kidding? We would have wanted to lock and load and go to the offensive if it wasn't for the fact we were there for training exercise. That meant we didn't have ammunition. We had M16s, but nothing to go in them. Well, we were now no longer laying on our cots. Instead, we were getting dressed and discussing who it is that is going to go investigate with an unloaded rifle. Just when we heard the sounds come to our door, it was not human. We could hear them breathing loud. Our PFC was the one who had been picked to lead the charge, but he flat out refused. None of us blamed him. We didn't want this to become some Alaskan version of Southern Comfort meets Predator, if you know what I mean. So we all sat in silence for 10 or so minutes until the huffing and snorting faded away. A few minutes afterwards, we manned up and opened the door. We immediately saw in the snow the largest frickin' wolf prints I have ever seen. I swear they were the size of a pie plate. Anything attached to those paws must have been the size of a small horse, or at least a dining table. So, about that outhouse. You remember the one a few hundred yards away? Well, it used to be that if you woke up in the middle of the night and needed to drain yourself, you would take the hike down to the outhouse. Not anymore. Instead, we made a massive patch of yellow snow right next to the door. It became customary to open the door, point to the side, and melt some snow. There was no way on God's green earth anybody was walking all the way to an isolated outhouse with those beasts out in the dark. Okay, the story's almost over, just one little bit. After spending a weekend in Ketchikan, one of our buddies brought back his diving light. This thing was the brightest flashlight I have ever seen. It made the night into day. Anyway, one night we're joking and smoking. We were teasing one of the other guys because he had wanted to go out and take a dump in the outhouse. It wasn't like he could just hang his ass out the door. That is one thing we did want to find come spring, when the generals and other dignitaries would be touring the place. Not at all. The guy was starting to gather up the courage to actually head on down to the outhouse. Good for him. He got so far as to open the door, fully dressed for the freezing temperature. As he was about to walk out, the sergeant flicked on his diving light and pointed it towards the outhouse. He was being nice and was going to light the way. As that light poured down the hill, we could make out the outhouse, and wouldn't you know it, standing next to the crapper was a wolf. Its eyes lit up like two little moons. It stared up towards us. It didn't move, even though we were a good 300 feet or so from it. The guy needing to go to the bathroom hurriedly backwalked deeper into the hut. The sergeant kept his light shine on this unholy-sized wolf until it started to overheat. That wolf saw us. It knew there was more than one of us, yet it did not move an inch. It just stood there staring at us as we stared at it. When the sergeant turned off his diving light, it was still staring at us. It was us who had to break our gazes so that we could close the door. That wolf knew he was in charge. We knew it too. Next story. Every man in my family smokes a pipe. It has always been that way. When I turned 20, I decided I would take up the art. I had been in cigars for a few years and thought a pipe would be a nice alternative. Over the past few years, I've amassed a fairly large collection. One day I came across a few of my great-grandfather's old cobs. I decided to clean them up and put them on my rack. I knew I would never smoke them, so I removed the cake and polished them up a little. He had these pipes for years, and they were well worn and had oil and grease from his hands soaked in them. After a thorough cleaning, they looked good, and the smell of old Toby was gone. I put them on the rack and left them alone. After a few weeks, I went to trade out a few of my normal smokers and add a new one to my rotation. I noticed that one of the cobs was missing. I thought maybe it had fallen off, so I looked everywhere. It was gone. It puzzled me, so I thought about it a while. I came back after a few hours, and there it was. I picked it up, and it was very warm to the touch, with a smell of freshly smoked Toby on the bit and the bowl. Now, here is what's odd. I live alone. No one has been in the house in a few days beside myself and my dog. I thought that maybe Papa had enjoyed himself a smoke from his old pipe. I went out and bought his favorite tobacco and put it in a jar, along with my others. Every now and then the pipe will go missing for a day or two, then turn back up. I like to think that he's just enjoying a smoke and watching over me. It kind of comforts me knowing that he's still lingering around. I have on occasion thought I've seen him out of the corner of my eye, and even had a friend ask me once who the older man on the porch was. I said, "What do you mean?" And he said that on his way to the bathroom he noticed an elderly gentleman in overalls sitting in the rocker on my porch. I just smiled and said it was Papa having a smoke. Now, here's another story. I was on a camping trip with a few buddies. We had set up camp and were just lounging back around the fire. We were at Jekyll Island for the weekend, and we were waiting for the sun to go down to go fishing. As the sun was setting, we all said that the air felt weird, kind of heavy. We dismissed it as humidity and headed to the pier. We got there, and there were only 2 other fishers. We set up about 5 feet from each other and enjoyed the nice summer air. We had the radio going, and we were all talking. The DJ came on and gave the time and weather. It was 9:15 p.m. We talked a little bit more, and then the DJ came on again. My friend that was beside me complained because only one song had played. The DJ again gave the time and weather. It was 11:30 p.m. We all looked at each other, kind of weird, and checked our phones and watches. It was indeed 11:30. Never found out what happened to those 2 hours, but we were not drinking, and everyone on the pier experienced the same thing. The same missing time. Next story. This happened a few months back. It was nighttime and I was at my girlfriend's brother's house. We'd all gathered to watch the Super Bowl and it was just getting dusk. Her brother and his girlfriend are avid motorcycle bikers. He asked if I would help him take the bikes back to his shed, about 300 yards from his house. I said sure and went out to move them. After stepping into the cold, I decided I would go back in and get my jacket. He said that he would go ahead and move his and I could bring the other around when I got back. After about 2 minutes, he comes bounding back in. I look at him and make a smart-ass comment when I notice something is not right. He's standing in the kitchen, white as a sheet, and had literally peed his pants. We asked him what was wrong, and he didn't make a sound. He just stood there. Now, this is a guy who just turned 42. He's about 6'3" and weighs 240 pounds, an ex-Marine with 5 tours under his belt. He doesn't scare easily. After a few minutes, in a fresh pair of pants, he began to tell us what happened. Said after he'd stepped back in the shed and started around the back, the motion lights came on. He thought this was odd since all of us were inside, and the dogs were inside also. He stood the bike and walked around the house. As he was looking in the back, he saw something looking in the back window directly at us inside. He yelled out to it, and it turned to look at him. He said it was a large black mass. As it moved into the light at the edge of the porch, it cast no shadow. He said that it looked like a half man, half animal. He said that the face was as if he had mixed a dog and a man, and it had horns on the rear of its head. He realized he was about 30 feet from his truck with his pistol inside. As he backed up slowly, it matched him step for step. He took a quick glance at the truck, and when he turned back, it was gone. That's when he ran inside. Now, we were all freaked out, and the 3 guys stood out in the back with the lights on to see what it was. There was no sign of it, not even footprints. The ground here is very saturated from recent rains, and even the slightest person would leave a print in the mud. We looked at his prints, and you could see where he went out, stood, and then backed up. We tried to dismiss it as neighborhood kids playing a prank with a mask, but it still puzzles me. The thing that keeps coming to mind is a demon, but then again, luckily, he hasn't seen it. None of us have. Next story. Back in 2000, I was 18 and living at my parents' home. They live on a long private drive. It was a two-story house with a walkout basement. They had left to visit my grandmother, but I had to stay behind because of work, leaving our dog Melody at home with me. She was a collie mix, around 60 pounds, and the most obedient and sweetest dog ever. She was used to camping and being outdoors. She never barked at noises. I invited a coworker over, and I'll call her Sarah, to watch some movies because I hated being home alone. This was summer and the neighbors on both sides of the house were out of town. One house had a 30-acre forest next to it. I had a third neighbor that lived a quarter-mile away through a thick stand of white pine. My friend and I were pretty isolated. It was getting dark and we were watching TV. We made some popcorn. Melody was in the living room with us, sleeping, when she suddenly jumped up and looked out the window, growling. I'd never heard her make noises like this before. Horrible growling. Her hair was up from her neck to the base of her tail. I looked out the window, but couldn't see anything, and closed the window and the curtain. I was a bit nervous because Melody was acting very strange. Sarah thought the dog had heard a coyote. When she went back to watching TV, I checked the locks with the dog. Melody calmed back down and went to sleep, so I calmed down too. I figured if the dog was relaxed, all was good. We watched TV until almost midnight. I wasn't ready for bed because of the scare. Suddenly, the dog went crazy again. She was growling, barking, hair on end. This time it was enough even my friend got freaked out. I didn't want to call the cops because my dog was barking weird, so I said first we would look around a bit. I turned out the lights in the room and then looked out the living room window. Nothing was on that side of the house. I wanted to look out the back of the house, but to do that I would have to go downstairs. The dog would not follow me. I decided to go look out from our back deck. It didn't have any stairs, so I figured I would be safe. I turned off all the lights and the outdoor flood so I could get some night vision. My dad's house is very well lit at night. Then I slowly opened the door and crawled out on the deck. It was quiet outside. The driveway was empty. The area by the barn was clear. My mind was telling me to go back inside. Then I crawled to the far side of the deck and looked at the neighbors by the woods. Under their deck was a shadow, a tall shadow. At first I thought it was a man standing by the deck support. Then it crouched down and looked up at me, and it had these eyes. I'm freaking out just thinking about it. How could I see its eyes when there were no lights but the moon? All I could see were the eyes. I had this feeling of pure evil looking at me. I was back in the house so fast, locking the door and grabbing Sarah and the dog, pushed her down the hall to my parents' room, shutting and locking the hall door and then my parents' bedroom door. I got all the guns out of my dad's gun safe in the room and loaded them. He has quite a collection of newer pistols. Sarah was freaked because I wasn't saying anything, just loading guns she didn't even know I had. Then I got them into the bathroom and locked that door. We sat there with guns pointed at the door. Neither one of us had enough courage to leave the room for the phone. We started praying. Eventually, the dog calmed down and we slept in the bathroom on the floor. The next morning, I called my parents and told them they had to come home that day. This story still freaks me out so much that my husband only has to say it has eyes and I'm terrified. I love backpacking in the outdoors, but I will never solo camp. Whatever that was is out there and I do not want to meet it alone, unarmed. Also, I will always own a dog. They are so tuned into the surroundings. I don't know if Melody would have protected me from it, but she saved me from meeting it that night in the yard. I would have gone out that evening with her to let her use the bathroom if she hadn't barked and warned me.